Welcome, Capstone learners. We are on to our final video here considering the Chapter 3 materials of your research project. We're going to look at the data sources and ethics that go into Chapter 3 of your research project. What material have you collected? That's an important question to kind of look at as we go forward here in Chapter 3. As you look through your procedures, you'll want to consider the materials that you need to conduct your study. We reviewed this a little bit in a previous video, but we want to look at the lists of supplementary resources. Did you use lesson plans? Are they listed? Worksheets, activity sheets, directions, instructions, handouts, forms, so on and so forth. There's all of these pieces that you want to have here. You want to make extra sure that you have all of those things mentioned inside Chapter 3. These are the things that you'll talk about that you need to move the study forward. And then finally, once the material is done, as we spoke about a while back, you're going to change the future tense of what you planned to do going forward to what you actually did. And so making sure that all of these pieces in here are there and a part of the Chapter 3 process. These are typically placed in the appendix section, like we mentioned before, following your paper. Again, each item you use requires a new appendix. So, for instance, Appendix A, B, and so on. Ethics. Informed consent is the first part of ethics that we want to take a look at. Again, we're dealing with people, and the IRB does a fantastic job of ensuring that you maintain the safety and the anonymity of these people that you're working with. And so vital to your study and a large part of the process of IRB, these are things that that group will look at for you. And you want to make sure that you are mentioning this as clear as possible within your chapter. Informed consent. How did you secure permission to collect the data from the students in your classroom or from your work environment? Did you have an opt-out procedure? An example would be, how could parents opt out of having their child's information included in a study? You have to give those participants the opportunity to opt out of a study. You just can't expect that they're going to do that, and that piece of information is absolutely crucial. Opt-out applies generally to data collection. However, if it's working in a class situation, the students don't necessarily have the ability to opt out of instructional activities. If that's part of their normal everyday educational activity, they can't opt out of that. However, they don't have to participate in the study that you're doing that fits in that normal part of the academic day, so they can opt out of the data that you're collecting. Again, what about confidentiality? How do we maintain complete confidentiality so as not to put any potential danger in the way of our participants? So, how did you protect those? How did you protect the gathering of the data? How did you keep the securing of the data there? Sometimes the data as you collect it, is it in a secure location online? Are you securing hard copies somehow, some way, in a manner that people can't get at that? That may seem unusual to you, but it's important that we make sure that every step is taken to maintain confidentiality. Another issue that you want to consider is coding names and identity. If you're going to gather names from people and use those people in the study, you can't obviously go forward and you don't want to use those names. So you're going to have to issue codes. Whether you use codes by number, by letter, or in some other way, make sure that you're doing that in a consistent manner, that you have an understanding of who's who in your study. And then publicly reporting the results. As you go forward in your study and you drop these pieces in, make extra sure that everything is coded appropriately. These are absolutely crucial items that you need to have in maintaining what we call an ethically clean study. This isn't a section of your paper per se, but it's important to kind of look at it as we try to wrap up Chapter 3. You should seriously consider the trustworthiness of your work. Will your results, which you will talk about in Chapter 4, be credible as you consider them through these particular measures? Prolonged engagement. Did you gather data long enough to potentially see a change? We're working in a 16-week window here within the WLC program. And so a lot of times your testing can only last a certain amount of time before things need to move on. Did you gather data long enough to potentially see a change? How about persistence in observation? Did you collect the data repeatedly? Is that something that was an important part of the process, and how repeatedly did you do that? We want to look a little bit at the concept of triangulation. Do you have at least 3 different sources of evidence? That's a way people typically look at triangulation, but there's another way of doing it. Essentially, what we want to do is to look in, are your hypotheses, your educated beliefs on this supported by the study, as well as potentially supported by the research that you've done? We want to make sure that you've got evidence that supports the triangulation as we move forward. Have you provided clear, convincing, consistent evidence to support your claims? Are you being thorough as you move forward? And that's something that will actually show up more in Chapter 4, but start thinking about it already. If your colleague looks at your findings, and we're really bridging 3 and 4 here, would they ring true to him or her? Would your students agree with your findings? Have you asked them? Have you employed enough thick, rich description to help the reader decide if your processes or results could be transferred to a different setting? In other words, this deals with the thoroughness of your research. Could somebody pick up and continue to use your study as a springboard to other things in another location, with another instrument, things of that nature? And finally, the biggest thing, are your findings transparent? Is it easy to see from the data why your claims have surfaced? If there's any sort of muddy water that kind of goes into that, your capstone committee may question you on that. Your mentor might make you come back and look at this again. Again, if someone else looked at your raw data, would they arrive at the same conclusion as that in which you put into narrative form within your paper? Those are all key things you want to take a look at. If there's any lack of clarity, a couple things you might want to consider are these. Contact your capstone mentor. Ask them if there's another angle in which you need to look at this. Do that on the front end. Think about that up front so that you're not in week 13, 14, maybe even 15 trying to think about how that works. Look and see if you can anticipate any of those potential lack of clarity moments where you can kind of come back and say, you know what, I better check this again. The information comes from Lincoln and Guba below and talks a little bit about this through naturalistic inquiry. Awesome resource in trying to understand how to look at the trustworthiness of your work. So we're at the end of Chapter 3. We want to summarize this very, very briefly and bring this chapter to a close. So again, we want to briefly restate the main components of your procedures. I think that's really what we want to know, and keep it brief. A couple paragraphs will get this done. So we're looking at a total 30,000 foot view. Again, we're bringing closure to Chapter 3, so it'll appear to you like we're finishing off a miniature paper talking about what we're planning on doing. You're free at this point to offer some transitional statements that look ahead to the findings in Chapter 4. But again, really be brief and wait to offer the findings until Chapter 4. So you can use it kind of as a sneak preview, but don't give away the punchline to what's to come. Again, we only are really looking for a paragraph or two here, so be brief, be precise, and be very succinct with the way that you want to put this piece together. And that will conclude your work on Chapter 3. At this point, you've laid out exactly what you plan to do. You've expressed the need for this study. The fun really begins as we get into Chapter 4 and you conduct the study and you find out the findings in the research, as well as where we could go beyond as we look at Chapter 5. So we are at probably a pretty natural spot between what you've planned and what you plan to execute. It's a great place to be. I wish you God's blessings as you transition into this stage, and look forward to incredible work from all of you. God bless.